Hey there, and welcome to the Deep Dive. We're your guides as we unpack a stack of source material, searching for those nuggets of knowledge that make you instantly better informed.
Yeah, our goal is really to cut through the noise, maybe explore some surprising facts, and just make dense topics approachable. Like having a chat with a friend who's already done all the reading for you.
Exactly. And today, we're plunging into the early days of a specific YouTube series, RGC Chats, which stands for Retro Games Couple Chats. We've got the transcripts from their first 5 videos.
Right.
And our mission for this deep dive is basically to explore the landscape they covered right at the beginning of their show.
And that landscape, it's pretty foundational stuff for gaming discussions, isn't it? They kicked off tackling that big retro versus modern games debate, and they zoomed right into game difficulty, the rise of live service games, which is relatively recent.
Yeah.
Then a big sweep through console history, and finally they did a genre deep dive into fighting games.
So yeah, consider this like a guided tour through the first chapter of the RGC Chat story. We'll pull out the core ideas, the perspectives they shared, and just kind of see what picture emerges of their view on gaming right from the get-go.
What were the key points they really wanted to hammer home? What sort of journey did they take their audience on in just these first 5 chats? Okay, let's unpack this.
All right, so kicking off with their very first chat, episode 1, they dove straight into, probably one of the most classic debates among gamers. Were retro games better than modern games?
Right, and it seems less about finding like a definitive yes or no answer, and more about exploring all the different facets of the argument,
Totally. And right away, they started drawing these pretty strong contrasts, how they saw older games versus newer ones. When they described retro games, they used terms like masochism.
Masochism. That's telling, isn't it?
It really is. And they linked that directly to this idea of endless hours of gameplay. But they clarified it wasn't always because the games were huge. It was often because they were just incredibly difficult.
And that difficulty wasn't just pure reflexes either. They mentioned head-scratching puzzles.
Ah, right.
Which could also just stop you dead in your tracks for ages.
Yeah.
But alongside that challenge, they did talk about positive stuff too, improving your reflexes, providing pure entertainment, having a very good story. And this is interesting, having new graphics, art, and a distinct sense of art and a point of view.
That feels really important, that distinction. Art and a point of view, implying like a creative vision, a unique identity.
Exactly, which contrasted sharply with how they initially framed modern games.
Yeah, what was that?
Well, for modern games, the main highlight, at least right at the start, was graphics, with a capital G almost.
Okay.
They've talked about how incredible graphics are now, even photorealistic, especially in genres like sports games. That seemed to be the big, obvious thing that jumps out.
So from their perspective in that first chat, it was kind of like retro games challenge, unique art, vision, while modern games, amazing visuals, first and foremost. That sets up a fascinating tension right from the start, doesn't it?
It really does. And that tension immediately brings us to the first major theme they kept circling back to in these early chats. Difficulty. They basically argue that those endless hours spent on retro games often came from them being, masochistically difficult.
And they didn't just say it. They gave some pretty painful sounding examples, like needing pixel-perfect jumps in platformers, where missing by, a single pixel means instant death. Or spending ages on one enemy. One host initially said 50 minutes for an enemy in FF12, then kind of corrected it to 20 minutes as a more general example.
It's still a long time for one fight.
Right. Just one encounter taking forever in older RPGs. And maybe the most brutal example, losing a life often meant starting the entire level over again.
Ah, yeah. The Castlevania special.
Exactly. They kept bringing up Castlevania as brutal, relentless. One mistake, way late in a long, tough level. Boom, right back to the very beginning.
And this is where the contrast with modern games really stood out in their chat. They mentioned features like dynamic challenge, where the game actually adapts to how you're playing, and, crucially, quick saves and checkpoints. Dying doesn't mean losing half an hour of progress anymore. It's back to the beginning of the room, or just the last quick save.
Some even have time rewind, right? Just zap back a few seconds.
Yeah, exactly. Correct those little mistakes.
And their takeaway from this huge difference, they basically said that spending like 3 hours to beat a game that, if played perfectly, only takes maybe 28 minutes.
Right.
Just because you're constantly restarting huge chunks.
Yeah.
That wasn't always fun.
Yeah, they made a really clear distinction. They said that experience felt more like a pure challenge, like a test of endurance and perfect execution, rather than a game in the sense of, an enjoyable, flowing, interactive experience.
And this idea came up again later when they flat out said old games often lacked fairness.
Right. The design philosophy felt like the game was saying, cut your butt to beat me. Like the difficulty was sometimes just an unfair barrier designed to make you suffer or just pad out the playtime.
It's a strong way to put it, separating that pure skill test from the overall experience. Okay, so after setting up that core difficulty contrast, they started looking at how different genres have evolved.
Yeah, they did a pretty quick tour through a bunch of them. Horror, for instance. They kind of questioned if it even really existed as a proper genre before 1992, outside of maybe text adventures.
Really? What was the turning point then?
Alone in the Dark, 1992. They cited that as the first time they felt a 3D game was genuinely scary.
Ah, okay.
And they were pretty clear that modern horror games get a massive boost from tech. The immersiveness, the amazing graphics. It lets developers build environments that really make you live in this space and actually be afraid.
So that's one area where they saw new games offering something genuinely more impactful.
Definitely. An area where new games clearly offer more, was how they put it, than RPGs. They acknowledged how huge old ones could be, 50, 100 hours.
Yes, the epics.
Right. And while modern ones like Baldur's Gate 3 or Witcher 3 are just as massive, the RGC hosts felt the core RPG genre hasn't actually changed too much beyond the graphics.
Interesting. Why did they think that?
Well, one host, who identified as a big RPG fan, basically argued that the genre's tested almost every system possible over the decades. Turn-based grids, real-time action, hybrid systems.
Yeah, there's been a lot of experimentation.
Exactly. And so, in their view, that saturation of mechanics makes it hard to find truly original gameplay ideas in RPGs now. It's mostly refinement and, well, much prettier visuals.
Okay, makes sense. What about sports games?
Sports games. They track the visual jump from, simple top-down views in Kickoff or Sensible Soccer to isometric like FIFA 94, and now to totally photorealistic graphics. They kind of questioned where else can it even go visually.
Yeah, what's next?
Right. They suggested that beyond just updating the player rosters each year, there isn't much fundamentally new to sell. Making those yearly updates may be only essential for the real hardcore fans.
They did mention the immersion factor, though, right? Seeing real players rendered so well.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And they pointed out how things like manager modes, which used to be separate games.
Right, like Championship Manager.
Yeah, now they're just integrated features within the main FIFA or whatever, probably because programming that stuff is just easier now.
Yeah.
Their conclusion was basically that sports games have kind of peaked.
Did they miss anything from the older ones?
Actually, yeah. They mentioned missing the sort of violence or arcadey fun of older games like NBA Jam.
Oh, yeah. He's on fire.
Exactly. They felt there's been a pacification trend where modern sports games focus almost entirely on technical simulation instead of that exaggerated, maybe more purely fun interaction.
Interesting point. Okay, racing games.
Racing games. They admitted they didn't have tons of personal experience, but saw the same pattern. Super photorealistic cinematic visuals are king.
And peripherals, too, right? Wheels and pedals.
Yeah, they noted that became a bigger thing once you got realistic 3D cockpit views, made those peripherals feel more necessary, maybe.
But again, they questioned the originality.
Yep, suggested a similar peak had been reached, just like with sports games. They did mention Forza 5 and 7 as examples of just stunning graphics and covering loads of different racing styles.
All right, first-person shooters. Sounds like one of them was a big fan.
Oh, yeah. Played them fanatically, was the word. And had a pretty strong opinion. There's nothing original anymore.
Ouch.
Yeah. Felt most big AAA FPS games are basically the same, sometimes even just copying mechanics from each other. They cited Shadow Warrior 3 borrowing heavily from Doom Eternal as an example.
Were there any exceptions for them?
They mentioned Serious Sam 4 sticking to its old-school arena shooter roots. But they actually expressed displeasure with Doom Eternal itself, feeling it turned the series into a circus.
A circus? How so?
They didn't elaborate much in this chat, but it suggests maybe too many mechanics, too much complexity compared to the older Dooms. They also briefly mentioned Wolfenstein's direction, but only kind of hinted it might tie into a future woke or not topic they planned.
Ah, okay, teasing future content.
Yeah, without actually getting into that particular discussion here.
Gotcha. Adventure games, did they see those as dying out?
Sort of. They noted a revival, surprisingly, but the main example was Baldur's Gate 3. which is more RPG, right?
Yeah, definitely RPG first.
But it fits that trend of big, narrative-heavy games getting mainstream attention. They did lament the perceived death of traditional AAA adventure games, like the classic point-and-clicks. Said it's mostly remasters now, like Monkey Island or a small scene in indie and mobile.
Any specific modern ones they discussed?
They mentioned Siberia 4, guessing its sales weren't great. But they did talk about Life is Strange as a high-class adventure game, probably meaning like AA production values.
The first one especially.
Yeah, they really praised the first one's time rewind mechanic, being able to undo choices, dialogues. That was cool. They speculated, and this is just speculation, that maybe Life is Strange 2 wasn't as well received, partly because its main mechanic, auras to read emotions or whatever, just wasn't as interesting or powerful time rewind.
Rather than other potential reasons.
Right. Again, they sort of hinted maybe it related to the woke topic for later, but didn't actually discuss it here. Just threw it out there as a possibility for why reception differed.
Okay. Platformers. Still going strong.
Oh, yeah. Described as coming out by the bucket load. You've got the old guard still going, Mario, Crash, Ratchet and Clank, plus new ones. They just consistently sell well, seem to be the takeaway.
And fighting games. Just a quick mention.
Pretty much in this first chat. Listed the big names Street Fighter, Tekken, Soul Calibur, and some niche or reviving ones like King of Fighters, even a Fatal Fury rumor. Their main thought was that any genre revival seems more about bringing back the existing audience, the older players, rather than pulling in huge numbers of brand new players.
Okay. Was there any genre they thought had really flourished in the modern era?
Yes. Action-adventure, especially with RPG elements mixed in. They felt this genre has truly bloomed, and deservedly so.
Why now, specifically?
They directly credited the availability of sheer computing power. Modern hardware allows for the kinds of experiences those games offer.
Like Zelda.
Exactly. They use Zelda as the prime example. So there's basically no relationship between early Zeldas on NES or N64 and modern epics like Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom. The tech evolution just enabled completely different kinds of games.
Wow, no relationship is strong.
It is.
Yeah.
Shows how transformative they felt the tech jump was. They also threw Uncharted and the Tomb Raider reboots into this category of successful modern action adventures.
And this naturally leads to the Souls-likes, right? Elden Ring and that whole phenomenon.
Yep. They discussed Elden Ring, though one host did briefly mix it up with Elder Scrolls, then corrected themselves. They saw these action RPGs as successfully blending that brutally difficult like the old days feel, but crucially with modern conveniences.
What made the difficulty different in their eyes? More fair.
Exactly. They used the word fair to describe Souls-like difficulty, contrasting it with what they felt was sometimes unfair, brutal difficulty in older games. The modern conveniences included things like, options to maybe tone the battle down if you summon help, or reduce AI difficulty indirectly, or even getting a slight boost if you fail repeatedly at the same spot.
And the ability to change difficulty on the fly.
That was a big one they highlighted as a positive modern feature, being able to lower the difficulty in real time if you're truly stuck, unlike old games where picking hard at the start might mean you just hit a wall later and had to restart everything.
Speaking of being forced into difficulty, they mentioned gatekeeping in really old games.
Yeah, like some NES or SNES era games, literally locking the final levels or the true ending behind the hard difficulty setting.
Ouch. So you had to beat it on hard to see everything?
Pretty much. Forcing a replay just to access content felt like a different kind of artificial extension, maybe.
Okay, this is getting a bit negative on the retro side. Did they have anything positive to say about recapturing that retro feel?
Yes, definitely. Indie games. They argued indie devs are doing a very good job at taking those old graphics we remember and like, especially pixel art, but making them much better by using modern gameplay techniques.
So it's like the best of both worlds.
Kinda, yeah.
Yeah.
Their point was that indie games often deliver the impression of retro games as we fondly remember them, maybe forgetting how frustrating they actually were sometimes.
Like the Castlevania example again. Takes a summer in memory, but only 28 minutes actual playtime.
Exactly. So indie games add modern conveniences, save states, restarting from level beginnings, instead of the whole game making that feel of retro enjoyable without the original pain points. Yeah. They mentioned a wonderful Castlevania clone, a Metroidvania, that did this really well. For them, indie games are almost like what saves the retro ones by updating the experience for today.
Interesting take. Did they touch on any other genres briefly?
Just a quick mention of puzzle games, saying they're similar to platformers, maybe limited innovation beyond graphics. And they noted the modern state of Fallout XCOM type games, saying XCOM had a definite renaissance recently.
Okay. And how did they wrap up that first chat?
Basically by turning it over to the listener.
Yeah.
Asking for their opinions, older versus new versus indie, what they think the future holds.
Yeah.
Very conversational ending.
Right. So that first chat laid out the big debate, used lots of genre examples, but clearly difficulty was a massive theme.
Absolutely central. And that's exactly where they went for RGC Chats So 2.
Episode 2, focusing entirely on difficulty, and they brought in a guest.
Yeah, Panos Retro Showcase joined them for this one. It was a real deep dive just into difficulty, building directly on everything from Chat 1.
How did they kick it off?
In a super relatable way, actually. Asking about rage quitting. You know, that moment of pure frustration where you just want to break your controller or keyboard.
Oh, yeah. Been there.
Right. And they immediately drew a line between feeling that way with modern games versus the sheer rage induced by some retro titles.
Where did they trace that intense retro difficulty back to?
Straight back to the 80s arcades. They argued that outrageous difficulty was often a deliberate business tactic.
To make more money.
Exactly, to get all your change.
Yeah.
Design the games to be progressively more and more difficult, up to impossibly difficult, partly to foster a kind of masochistic addiction, keeping players pumping in coins.
Wow.
They also added a practical point. Sometimes the difficulty wasn't even intentional design, but just came from playing on wrecked arcade cabinets with busted buttons or sticky joysticks.
Right. That adds another layer of frustration. So the big question then is, why did that carry over to home consoles?
That was exactly their question. Why, when porting these games home, especially before the PS1 era, didn't they just tone it down, make it more playable without needing a pocket full of quarters?
What were their theories?
They floated a few ideas. Maybe companies just prioritize profit over player fun. Maybe they literally just reuse the same arcade code. Difficulties in the code in the chips, they said, to save money, because making different versions or backups might have been harder back then.
So cost-cutting, basically.
Could be. They definitely recalled the frustration of getting a home port and finding it just as punishing, leading to broken joysticks and keyboards.
Oh.
It wasn't until much later, with MAAIM emulators giving infinite credits in easy modes, that a lot of people could finally beat those old arcade beasts.
And this ties into artificial game length on early consoles too, right? Like the NES?
Absolutely. They argued that on 8-bit systems, extreme difficulty was often used deliberately to make short games seem longer, to justify the price tag. An artificial extension so that you don't cry for your spent money, was the quote.
How did they describe the mechanics?
Limited lives, often no continues, and absolutely no checkpoint. One or two mistakes, and you're right back at the title screen.
Castlevania again?
Castlevania again. The prime example. One host remembered spending 3 months playing it daily as a kid.
Yeah.
Only to find out later, using save states, the actual perfect playtime is just 28 minutes.
Wow. That's brutal.
And they mentioned specific Spanish developers on home computers who seemed to specialize in making games that lasted maybe 15, 28 minutes, but were just impossible. Pure sadism.
Yeah.
They named names. Game Over and its sequel, Game Over 2, as peak examples of games designed just to frustrate you.
Okay, so when did this era of, well, extreme difficulty start to ease up, according to them?
Around the PS1 era, mid-90s, they noted games started becoming somewhat easier from then on.
What changed?
Gradual introduction of things we take for granted now. Infinite continues, proper checkpoints within levels.
Yeah.
They also pointed out that collectibles like the diamonds, coins, apples, and Spyro or Crash, those became like an extra layer of challenge or a goal for completionists, because just finishing the game wasn't the insurmountable hurdle it used to be.
Right, the goal shifted slightly. So fast forward to today, 2024, how do they see difficulty in mainstream games now?
Their view. Very playable, often extremely passable, even on normal difficulty. One host even joked, normal is as a joke sometimes.
Meaning too easy.
Yeah, the feeling was that the priority now is much more on letting the players see the story, have a good time, rather than constantly hitting brick walls. They described the modern AAA structure as game, dash, cinema, lots of cutscenes, maybe more guided progression.
And modern games have lots of aids to help with difficulty, right?
Tons. They highlighted systems that automatically lower the difficulty if you keep failing at the same spot, common in FPS games, for instance.
How does that work?
They described like you die 7 or 8 times at one checkpoint, and a prompt might pop up asking if you want to lower the difficulty, maybe just if only for this checkpoint.
Okay. Temporary help.
Exactly. Let you get past that hump, then maybe it goes back up. While they saw this as adapting to player needs, which is good, one host did miss the old way of save load as we wanted. Felt that manual save system control is kind of dead, replaced by these automated checkpoints.
But here's a weird thing. If games are easier, why are completion rates apparently so low? Did they talk about that?
They did. They brought up stats suggesting only like 28–30% of players finish some big FPS games they buy.
That is low.
Right. It made them wonder why, if games are so accessible, do people just not have the time anymore? Or the attention span? Do people still dedicate months to beating really hard games like they used to? Good questions.
And they contrasted this mainstream ease with indie games, didn't they?
Yeah, specifically calling out brutal indie difficulty in games like Super Meat Boy. These games deliberately embrace that 80s-level challenge, pixel-perfect jumps, insta-death everywhere.
Who plays those then?
That was their question. Who actually finishes these incredibly tough indie games? Is it just a small, dedicated niche? Or do lots of people buy them, play for half an hour, hit a wall, and just give up?
It maybe points to a shift in what people want from games generally.
Exactly. Which ties into their idea of speed in the matter of fun. They suggested the current era, maybe influenced by mobile gaming, is all about instant gratification.
Get to the good stuff quickly.
Yeah. See the story, play, enjoy it now. Have the game massage my brain gently instead of constantly beating you over the head.
But they did praise some modern difficulty options, right? Like adjustable settings.
Oh, absolutely. They really like the trend of having separate difficulty sliders for different things like combat, puzzles, exploration, especially in horror games.
How so?
Well, you could choose to focus on being scared but have easier combat, or vice versa, have challenging combat but maybe easier puzzles so you don't get stuck. They call this adaptation to player needs very nice, very good.
This really highlights two different philosophies of game design.
Totally. One RGC host even identified themselves as coming from the school of challenge, valuing that tough but fair pushback. While newer games often feel more like the school of game, focus on the experience, seeing the story, you don't have to be good, just press the buttons, it will play out.
Did they mention any other modern aids they found? Less helpful.
Yes. Aiming assistance in console shooters got a mention, and they specifically called out the automated hint system in God of War 2018, the one with Atreus.
Ah, the son who gives hints.
Yeah. Apparently, if you linger too long on a puzzle, he just blurts out the solution. One host was clearly annoyed, joking, "Damn child, shut up, I want to think a bit."
Huh. Yeah, I can see that being irritating if you want to figure out yourself.
Definitely. And speaking of God of War, that led to a critique of a specific puzzle in the original God of War.
Not a real puzzle, they said.
Right. It involved quickly throwing Kratos' axe at multiple targets before they reset. They felt it wasn't about thinking. It was just pure timing, speed challenge like an annoying 8-bit leftover that had actually made them rage quit the game back in the day.
Interesting. Did they touch on the games as movies debate? People who just want a story experience?
They did acknowledge that prospective gamers who want a pleasant 8-hour interactive movie without much struggle. But one host seemed quite critical of games they felt went too far, specifically calling out Kojima's games like Death Stranding for having, in their view, way too much cinematic content versus gameplay. The estimate was like 60 minutes walking, 10 minutes playing, 50 minutes movies.
Okay, so what's their ideal difficulty sweet spot then?
One host summed it up as medium difficulty, something hard, challenging, but ultimately passable. Not completely ball-busting, not needing a neurologist, but also not so easy. You breeze through a 60, 70 euro game in 3 hours. Needs enough pushback to feel rewarding and worth the money.
And they had a specific era in mind for getting difficulty options right.
Yeah, they called the PS1 era's simple, easy, medium, hard selection system the golden one.
Why golden?
Because it catered to everyone. Beginners could pick. Easy, experienced players could go for hard, extending playtime. Plus, beating it on hard often unlocked extra stuff, like cutscenes, rewarding completionists. Simple, but effective for different skill levels.
They also briefly mentioned input methods adding to old-school difficulty.
Yeah, just a quick point about playing on old computers with weird keyboard layouts, like QAOP for movement.
Oh, man. Yeah.
Made hard games even harder compared to modern gamepads. Though one host said they were used to keyboards, they did mention old ball mice being a pain for precision, too.
Okay. Any specific game series they tracked difficulty changes in?
Final Fantasy. They felt games after FF8 generally got easier, citing FF9 and 10 as feeling notably less challenging than earlier entries.
How do modern FFs handle difficulty then?
They suggested modern games maybe including FF, shift the extreme challenge away from the main story and onto optional completionist goals, finding every hidden item, beating super hard optional bosses. That stuff can be up to impossible. They also noted FF16 even has an explicit easy battles option just for players who only care about the lore story.
Right, separating story from challenge. How did they wrap up this difficulty deep dive?
By teasing the next topic, live service systems, framing it as how companies try to give games extra life. And they promised future episodes specifically on microtransactions and loot boxes, noting they're related but a separate beast. Then again asking the listener for their thoughts on difficulty and rage quitting.
Okay, that sets up episode 3 perfectly. RGC Chats 03, live service games. Panos is back for this one too.
Yep, Panos joins them again. And they start by defining the opposite, the traditional model. Game as a product.
How did they define that?
Simple, really. You buy a game, it's complete, has everything you need in the box. You play it, finish it, put it on the shelf. Done. Maybe patches existed, but the core thing was self-contained. This applied to all retro games in the beginning, they said, up until maybe 20 years ago. They called these the golden times.
Golden times. Okay. And the contrast is live service games, or LSGs.
Right. Not a finished product, but an ongoing service providing continuous entertainment. The key idea, players keep paying and keep paying.
Wow. Subscriptions.
Subscriptions, yeah, but also buying new characters, missions, cosmetics, battle passes, just constant new stuff being added that often requires payment.
And season passes definitely fall under this.
Absolutely. Paying for access to content over a season. That's a service, part of the LSG model.
Where did they see this model starting?
MMORPGs, World of Warcraft lineage. Those were the first true LSGs, and they felt it was justified there.
Why justified for MMOs?
Because it made sense, right? You're paying for constant online play, server upkeep, and you expect new quests, new expansions as part of that ongoing service. Though they noted the big MMOs weren't cheap, often full price, plus that monthly sub.
So the problem, as they saw it, came later.
Yeah, when this LSG model got forcibly applied to games that aren't primarily MMOs, they focused on recent AAA games, sometimes even marketed as single-player, putting single-player in quotes like Suicide Squad, Diablo 4, Diablo Immortal.
Why doesn't it fit well there in their view?
Because the core appeal often isn't endless online play. Players buy these games maybe to finish the story, have a contained experience. But then after the main campaign, they hit this infinite loop service part, endless dungeons, daily grinds, which just isn't what they signed up for or wanted after paying full price.
This led into microtransactions too, right? Like cosmetic stores?
Yeah, they talked about skin stores in games like Tekken 8. But they made a distinction here. They saw cosmetics as different from traditional DLC, which they still viewed as extra product, a distinct one-time purchase.
So cosmetics aren't the core issue.
Well, they mentioned the company line is often, we need to pay the servers for free online play. But the RGC hosts felt that wasn't really the essence of the problematic as a service model they were critiquing. Server costs are real, but selling skins isn't the same as locking core progression behind ongoing payments.
The real defining feature for them was the season or battle pass.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the core of the LSG model, paying for that ongoing service of content and progression systems.
Where did they think this push for passes and microtransactions came from?
Mobile gaming influence, primarily. Especially Asian mobile games, they suggested, were pioneers here, often initially tied directly to pay-to-win mechanics.
Pay to win, meaning?
Buying power-ups or advantages that made paying players the dominant gamers. A direct link between spending money and being better at the game.
And the company logic behind passes, even if not strictly pay to win.
Their take on the cynical company rationale was, if buying a pass doesn't give you some kind of advantage or exclusive progression boost, why would players keep buying it month after month? There needs to be a hook.
Though they admitted some mobile games handled it better.
Yeah, they acknowledged some managed a tasteful thing, offering good gameplay even if you didn't pay, although free players were still often handicapped, maybe slower progression, fewer resources, that kind of thing.
But their main focus was AAA console and PC games adopting this.
Definitely. They saw it as big publishers looking at the massive success of free-to-play mobile games and deciding to bring that model over to their established console PC franchises.
Driven by management.
That was their angle. The managerial logic is just about making dough. Seeing mobile profits and deciding, all right, let's apply this LSG model to Call of Duty, to Overwatch, whatever sells. The goal shifts from one big payday at launch to getting continuous, predictable monthly revenue. Instead of 500 million once, maybe aim for 50 million every month.
But the big problem here, they argued, is that these AAA games still charge full price up front.
Exactly. That's the key critique. You pay 60, 70 euros or dollars just to get in, unlike free mobile games. Then asking for more money constantly for the service feels way less fair.
Did they see any positives to the LSG model in AAA games?
They tried to be balanced, listing some potential upsides, though often framed cynically or from a specific viewpoint. Obviously, it's good for the company's bank account, making dough, producing lettuce, as they put it. Whales and initial buyers keep the money flowing.
And for certain players?
Yeah, potentially great for players who absolutely love a specific game and genuinely want to play it forever. For them, paying extra monthly for constant new stuff is a good deal.
And the games themselves can improve.
That was another point. LSGs have the chance when to become much better over time because devs can react to player feedback. They use Diablo 4 as a possible example, getting a massive upgrade makeover months after launch based on what players wanted. That wouldn't happen with a static game as a product, so it can actually be better for new players joining later.
Did they list any games they considered successful LSGs?
Yeah, they rattled off a list: Apex Legends, Destiny 2, Fortnite, Rocket League, Genshin Impact, GTA Online, Overwatch 2, Sea of Thieves, Path of Exile, Warframe, Dota 2, Fall Guys, Helldivers 2, and League of Legends, though noting it's also a MOBA.
Any standouts among those?
Genshin Impact and other Hoyo games got special praise. They felt Hoyo represented a peak in live service gaming, optimizing the model in that tasteful thing way.
How so?
By providing tons of continuous high-quality content, cutscenes, plot, lore, even for free players. Although, the gacha system is still there.
Yeah.
Occurring state exists without passes.
Yeah.
They explicitly said this is what other companies should be copying.
But most of their focus was on the downsides, especially when LSG feels forced onto a game.
Absolutely. That's where they saw it as fundamentally bad for players. When LSG mechanics are crammed into games not naturally suited for them.
Why is it bad? What does it force developers to do?
They argued it often requires designing game mechanics that are unfair, in air quotes. Not glitches, but systems built to create a constant challenge that will always increase.
Yeah.
Basically pushing you towards buying new items or power-ups because what you have will not be enough to keep up.
And this ruins the single-player experience.
Yeah, it makes it feel repetitive and not pleasant. They pointed to games like Avengers and Suicide Squad losing players super fast, 95% loss mentioned, as proof that people who bought them as regular games just weren't interested in playing that forever loop.
Plus, many LSGs end up on Game Pass or PS Plus.
Right, so people play them for free with their sub,
Yeah.
finish the main story, and then just leave when the game leaves the service or they get bored of the grind. No long-term investment.
They used Suicide Squad as a prime example of how forcing the model can ruin the game design itself.
Yes, that was their key case study. They argued that to make the LSG model work, needing to sell different guns with stats, the devs turned a game about unique superheroes into just a gun game.
Forcing characters to use guns instead of powers.
Pretty much. Characters with iconic abilities suddenly relying on machine guns and grenades. They felt this was inherently wrong, totally undermined the IP, and just resulted in a common and rather bad shooter, despite the strong Suicide Squad license.
What would have been a better LSG approach for that IP, in their view?
Something thematic, like creating Opponent of the Month or Quest of the Month, content that actually draws from the huge DC universe.
Yeah.
The villains, the storylines. Use the bank of older subjects instead of forcing a generic gear grind. That could have been successful.
So it comes back to management decisions again. Lack of imagination.
That was their critique. Managers just copying what worked elsewhere. No, I saw this. It works. I will do this. Instead of thinking creatively about how LSG could thematically fit a specific IP, they use that meme. But it has nothing to do with throws idea out window.
Right, forcing a square peg into a round hole.
Exactly. They circled back to the traditional MMO model again briefly, saying players knew they were getting ongoing updates, raids, etc. Mentioned FXX5E's success using the franchise history. Why did copying just the business model fail so often elsewhere?
And they praised Hoyo again for evolving that MMO model successfully.
Yeah, reiterated that Hoyo took the core MMO ideas and turned them into an amazing, successful LSG model where players are actually engaged and want more, even if some content is reskinned. That's the model to emulate, they felt.
How did this LSG chat wrap up?
Asking listeners again, do you like LSGs? Disappointed. Still playing Diablo 4 or Tekken 8? specifically mentioning the microtransactions there, and confirming the next chat was on consoles, with microtransactions loot boxes getting their own future episode, linking them to LSG, but also back to retro monetization.
Okay, leads perfectly into RGC Chats 04 game consoles, past, present, future, with Panos again.
Yes, Panos is back for the console history tour. He started by recounting his own journey. Began with home computers, then got an Atari 2600. Remember just being amazed by the instant on, plug it in and clack, it's on the screen.
Yeah, compared to cassette loading time.
Exactly. Then he went through the 8 bits, Master System NES, 16 bits, Mega Drive, SNES, TurboGrafx, and played up to the PS4, Xbox One X era.
And he became a console guy because he was lazy.
Huh. Yeah, that was his reason. Laziness. He just got tired of PC hassles, waiting for patches, fixing DLL errors, just getting games to run. He loved the old plug-and-play simplicity of cartridges and CDs, though he admitted modern consoles aren't quite like that anymore.
Did they mention the really old consoles? Before Atari?
Briefly, yeah. Magnavox Odyssey, Pong consoles, vector graphic stuff. Just acknowledged they existed but weren't part of their personal experience.
Then they got into the console wars, Sega versus Nintendo.
Oh yeah, the mid-'80s to mid-'90s rivalry. They compared the fanaticism back then to, like, sports team or political party rivalries in Greece. Huge deal. Sony's arrival with PlayStation kind of broke that specific dynamic.
How do they see the modern Sony versus Microsoft rivalry?
It exists, they said, but feels less tribal. More focused on the service's Game Pass versus PS Plus and exclusives. They painted Nintendo fans as a separate category, sometimes pure Nintendo loyalists. Acknowledged Nintendo is often innovative in design, but lags in hardware power.
Which might be deliberate, they suggested.
Yeah, maybe to keep costs down, a topic for another time, they teased.
Okay, so the big debate. Comparing console generations. Which was the best? Did they agree?
Definitely not. Different hosts had different peaks. Panos picked the PS1 generation, PS1, Saturn, N64.
Why that era?
He saw it as a middle age where things peaked. Praised the PS1 using CDs. No loading like cards, but crucially, no internet needed. The pure plug-and-play, ease, no profiles, no updates. Called it the real jump forward. Lamented modern 40 gigabit update. Frustration. Also noted N64 carts were fast-loading. Practicality and ease were key for him.
Okay, who did Spiros pick?
Spiros went slightly earlier, late 16-bit and early 3D, roughly 94-98, covering SNES, PS1, Dreamcast. For him, the biggest shock was Endless Mega Drive, bringing true arcade quality in our house. He argued those 16-bit high-definition sprites haven't aged, unlike NES graphics. Then the CD era, PS1, Dreamcast, brought cinematics, FMVs, all of that huge games.
And his view on consoles versus PC.
After that era, he felt consoles generally fell behind PC. Saw 16-bit consoles and old PCs as roughly comparable. But modern PCs clearly surpass current consoles technologically, in his view.
Okay, and Eva's pick?
Eva chose the PS2 era, PS2, original Xbox, GameCube, Dreamcast. She felt everything peaked with PlayStation 2.
Perfected the 3D revolution. Yeah, exactly. Refined what PS1 Dreamcast started. Better graphics, smoother gameplay, fewer bugs. Called PS2 and Xbox the best consoles because they were like the previous gen on steroids. She also felt this was the last time when the main consoles and PCs were clearly comparable, allowing for real debate about which was technically superior based on specific games. They mentioned the PS3's cell chip briefly as ambitious, but tricky.
Interesting picks. And this led back to the idea of modern consoles being more like a service.
Yep. Just like games, consoles have become less about the hardware box itself, which they felt is practically the same between competitors now, and more about the service platform. The real differentiators are the passes, exclusives, free monthly games, indie stores, the whole ecosystem.
And a huge part of that shift for them was the decline of physical copies. This was clearly a sore spot.
They mentioned streaming attempts like Stadia failing.
Yeah, cited Stadia's failure, maybe due to U.S. internet issues, as part of this push away from physical media and ownership.
Loss of ownership was the big issue.
Absolutely. The worst aspect, not truly owning your digital games. Companies can pull it and remove it from you, revoke access. They mentioned games disappearing from stores due to expired licenses, like music.
And even downloaded games aren't safe?
Nope. Many need online checks, so if the server goes down years later, the game might become unplayable. PC might be slightly better here due to mods, maybe, but still risky.
They also lamented losing the collecting aspect.
Deeply. The joy of building towers, of games on shelves, having a physical library, friends browsing it, compared it to a physical book library versus a Kindle library, just not the same feeling.
And for one host, it started even earlier, with manuals disappearing.
Yeah. That was the beginning of the end for one of them. Missing those wonderful booklets on shiny paper full of lore, art, instructions. They set the mood before you played. You'd sit down and look at it first. Found modern in-game tutorials invasive in comparison.
Does this tie into player habits changing? Less discovery?
They suggested maybe. Tutorials, YouTube guides, contribute to digital laziness dependence. Why bother exploring or figuring things out when the answer's online? And why fill hard drives when you could have a shelf?
They mentioned that Fallout collection with the keys.
Right. The mini new collector's edition that just had download codes inside, even for old games originally on disc. Stark example of the trend.
Plus the risk of censorship or removal.
Big concern. Companies can do everything they want with digital games, censor content, remove games entirely if licenses expire or for other reasons. You lose control.
Did Panos like Game Pass?
No, not for himself. Said he just doesn't have the time to play games enough while they're on the service before they might leave. Admitted it could be good for teenagers, maybe.
So the convenience factor of consoles has flipped.
Pretty much. Used to be a insert play. Now it's downloads, installs, updates, managing storage. Though they did concede, modern consoles get patches, potentially longer lifespans than some old, quickly abandoned systems like 3DO or Jaguar.
Hispiro stuck to his PC preference.
Yep. Reaffirmed PC has generally been better since it became upgradable, especially now with mods, skins, and often being ahead on tech like ray tracing, making new consoles feel dated faster.
Despite all that, Panos had a personal favorite console.
He did. Declared the PS2 Slim the best of all for him. Loved its size, peripherals, lightness. Just amazing, even with the known disc read issues. He did admit the original Xbox was technically beefier that gen.
And they acknowledged the PS2's massive success.
Oh yeah, mentioned the Guinness record sales, attributed it to the huge game library, and crucially, backwards compatibility with PS1 games, a feature they feel is sadly being lost now.
Which makes keeping old consoles important.
Absolutely. Need to keep those old machines running to play your original library, because you can't rely on new hardware or digital stores preserving everything.
They also shared a funny memory about consoles and the family TV.
Yeah. The classic struggle. Only one TV, and parents or grandparents wanting to watch their shows. They mentioned specific Greek soap operas, even did funny impersonations. Limited gaming time.
It puts the evolution in perspective.
Definitely. Panos and Spiros reflected on living through the whole thing from Pong and 4-color CGA graphics to today's cinematic visuals. Panos felt gifted to have seen that entire journey to the perceived graphical peak.
And maybe that peak is why people look back now.
They speculated, yeah. Maybe the saturation in modern super polished games and movies is making people appreciate the simpler, distinct look of retro games and pixel art again.
How did they end the console chat?
Explicitly said they'd return to microtransactions loot boxes next. Asked the listener for their favorite console gen and their thoughts on physical versus digital, making their own negative view on losing physical media very clear.
Okay, brings us to the final chat of this batch, RGC Chats 05. Fighting games then and now, with a new guest.
Yes, Namidag joined them for this deep dive into the fighting genre. They started way back at the origins. Mentioned heavyweight champ from '76 as maybe the first, just punches.
Simple stuff.
Very. One host's first memory was Yi-R Kung Fu, punches and kicks. Also mentioned karate champion, using 2 levers instead of buttons, which is unusual.
But the standard really became 6 buttons, right? Thanks to Street Fighter 2.
Exactly. 3 punches, 3 kicks, light, medium, heavy. That became the blueprint for years. Though Mortal Kombat was different, fewer attack buttons but dedicated run and block.
Wasn't SNK different too?
Yep. SNK's 4-button approach, A, B, C, D, based on their Neo Geo system. King of Fighters, Fatal Fury, used that layout standardly up until about 2001.
Then they defined combos.
Yeah, as linked hits, the opponent can't block if the first one lands. Mention games that really leaned into combos, like Killer Instinct with his huge 40-plus move combos.
Ultra combo.
Right, others pushed 60, 70 hits. Though they noted some early combo systems felt broken, like one hit guaranteeing a massive, unavoidable sequence.
Did they talk about where these games were popular?
Yeah, it touched on regional popularity. Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, huge in the West. SNK games like King of Fighters, Fatal Fury, massive in Japan, present in Western arcades, but just didn't catch on in the West quite the same way. Maybe the gameplay style didn't click as much.
This brought back memories of arcades for them.
Oh yeah, arcade culture. Recall the intense scene. Going to the Temple Arcade in Greece. Watching the really skilled players, the best in the temple, just own the machines and waiting your turn.
That atmosphere is hard to replicate.
For sure. They mentioned the gradual transition to home consoles, Street Fighter being a key example that made the jump successfully.
And Mortal Kombat's influence, the digitized graphics.
Big influence. Midway using photos of real people was revolutionary, leading to a whole wave of Mortal Kombat clones from companies like Acclaim. They mentioned Tattoo Assassins.
With the DeLorean fatality.
That's the one. Loads of fatalities, trying to copy the style, but rarely matching the original's quality.
Then came the jump to 3D Virtua Fighter.
Yeah, exactly. Sega's Virtua Fighter hailed as the revolutionary first 3D fighter. Noted its simplicity, just 3 buttons, guard, punch, kick, but surprising depth. They praised Virtua Fighter 3 on Dreamcast, especially for its flowy animation, making even simple moves look like combos.
And Soul Calibur took that further.
Definitely. Soul Edge on PS1, then Soul Calibur on Dreamcast, which they called Soul Edge 2. Soul Calibur got huge praise for advancing 3D fighting, fluid movement, effective sidestepping into the foreground-background.
Right, the 8-way run.
Yeah. Incredible animation and better frames connection, meaning linking moves felt more intuitive, more forgiving than earlier 3D games, largely thanks to the Dreamcast power.
Did they think that made it easier to play casually? Button mashy?
Kinda, yeah. Button mashing friendly was the term. Because the animation flowed so well, even if you were just hitting buttons, it looked like something cool was happening. You could react visually. You don't stop a combo whenever the character freezes. Made it accessible and fun for beginners, even if mastery still required skill.
And Soul Calibur had good single-player stuff, too.
Big praise for that. A lot of good content for single-player. Unlocking weapons, endings, armor break mechanics gave you reasons to play alone, which wasn't always the case for fighters back then.
Okay, jumping to modern fighting game trends. What did they discuss?
Balance patches came up first. How companies now pay a lot of attention to AAA fighters after launch. Beta tests, player feedback, releasing patches to fix things, trying to keep the games as fair as possible to keep the community happy and attract players.
But one host wasn't always happy with balance changes.
No, expressed frustration when patches change character frames or timing after you've spent ages learning them, especially if the character wasn't even considered OP, overpowered. Mentioned a recent Street Fighter 6 example where a small change messed up their muscle memory, which was irritating.
What about Dead or Alive? Fan service versus balance?
They touched on the urban legend that Due's fan service costumes could actually be distracting in competitive play, given the counter-heavy system. Also mentioned the Due 6 controversy, trying to tone down the fan service to appeal wider, but ended up alienating the core fans without really bringing in a new audience. Tricky balance.
Did they like modern fighting game stories?
Not really. Strong critique here. One host called Tekken 8's story crap, ridiculous, felt like it was written by a child, aliens and demons. Similarly, found Street Fighter V's story mode premise childish, like a bad 80s action movie plot.
What about anime fighters?
Mentioned as a big category, separate from 3D arena fighters like Dragon Ball Xenoverse. Focused on the 2D anime-style ones from Arceus BlazBlue, Guilty Gear, Dragon Ball FighterZ, and newer ones like Grand Blue Fantasy Verse.
And a big trend they noted was simplified controls.
Huge point. Adding simplified controls like the modern scheme in Street Fighter 6 or in Bandai Namco's anime games like JoJo lets you do special moves with way easier inputs.
Like one button plus a direction.
Yeah, instead of complex quarter circles or dragon punch motions, maybe just forward plus button for a Hadouken. Takes inspiration from platform fighters like Smash Bros, they suggest.
Right, add these.
To be friendly to the new audience, the casual audience, the mainstream players who buy the game because they like the anime license, but aren't going to spend hours learning execution. A proper marketing approach, they called it, to let people just enjoy pressing buttons and seeing cool stuff happen.
Do tournaments allow simplified controls?
They question that. It's an in-game option, so probably yes, but external macros would definitely be banned. Raises interesting balance questions for competition.
How did they wrap up the fighting game chat?
By promoting their own RGC videos on fighting games, encouraging viewers to check those out for more detail. And mention their guest Namidagra wanting to experience the Japanese arcade scene.
Wow, okay. That was quite the journey through those first 5 RGC chats. We went from pixel-perfect jumps all the way to photorealistic graphics, from rage-quitting arcades to live service season passes, console wars, losing manuals, and simplified Hadoukens.
It really was a whirlwind. And it paints a pretty clear picture, doesn't it? The RGC hosts definitely have a passionate, often quite opinionated, and, frequently nostalgic view on video games. It's heavily filtered through their own experiences growing up with those classic systems in arcade culture.
Absolutely. And across these 5 chats, you really see their core themes emerge, that constant tension, retro challenge and fairness versus modern accessibility and convenience. The strong sense of loss about the physical side of gaming, the hardware, the boxes, the manuals being replaced by digital services, and this feeling of, well, not really owning things anymore.
Yeah, that came through loud and clear. And their real skepticism, even criticism of business models like forced live service, where they feel corporate profit is being put way ahead of the player experience, sometimes even hurting the game design itself.
Their perspective feels distinct because it is so tied to that long history, right? Having lived through the whole evolution gives them this unique baseline for comparison.
Exactly. It shapes their opinions, leads to those strong critiques when they see things they perceive as a lack of originality or a negative shift in design philosophy or business practices compared to what they valued in the past.
So, taking all that in their perspective, rooted in nostalgia, their value placed on fair challenge, their lament for tangibility, their criticism of certain modern trends, the question is, based on these first 5 chats, is their series worth following?
Well, I think if that blend resonates with you, the personal stories, the historical context, the strong opinions on game design in the industry, the willingness to tackle topics like difficulty or monetization head on, then yeah, absolutely. Their planned dives into microtransactions, loot boxes, maybe even that woke or not topic, seem set to continue offering that same distinct viewpoint, grounded in their decades of gaming experience. It's definitely a specific lens, but a consistent and passionate one.
It makes you think, doesn't it? What stood out most to you listening to their points? Did their take on difficulty or the shift to live service maybe make you reconsider your own views?
Definitely food for thought. Their journey through those first 5 episodes certainly maps out a particular view of gaming's past and present, leaving you pondering where it's all heading next, especially when seen through the eyes of people who've been playing since the beginning.